Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So, we're probably going to spend a couple of weeks with me going back over some single books that aren't in series, because, I've been doing a series, alternating trilogies and tetralogies and so on and so forth for a while. So I'm going to take a couple of weeks break from that. Not counting my mother's memorial, which is a totally separate issue. So today I'm looking at a book that was given to me by a friend because I like church architecture. I like looking at it. I like the fundamental nature of churches, of religious architecture generally. I very much enjoy the quietude that you find in churches when, there's not a service going on, that there's something really, really enjoyable to me, pleasant, about the general contemplative nature of purpose-built religious buildings. And certainly I enjoy the architecture of the great churches, of the Chartres of the world, of before it caught fire, Notre Dame in Paris, in Paris. I need to stop trying to pretend I can speak French, because I can't. It's beautiful architecture with gorgeous additions and trappings and whatnot. But I equally enjoy small churches, as I said, for the quiet internal contemplative nature of the building, that whether or not you believe in a given religion, a building that is put to the purpose of contemplating the infinite tends to have a specific character to it. And so my friend has frequently wandered past book sales and picked this one up for me just because she knows I like this kind of thing. Now, this is a book that was photographed and the text composed for it and so on by Kim Ondaatje, who you may recognize the surname Ondaatje. That's because she was, at the time of this book at least, married to Michael Ondaatje, who, among other things, wrote the novel The English Patient, upon which the 1996 movie The English Patient is based. So, if you've heard of him at all, that's where you're most likely to have heard of him. And that's why the name will, if it seems familiar, that's why it would be familiar. Michael Ondaatje, moved to Canada in the 1960s and has basically lived here ever since. And so, they were both living here, and he's thought of as being one of those Canadian types. So this is an oversized paperback book. It's very much in the nature of coffee table books, except for the fact, of course, that it's paperback, which makes it a little weird. But I really, really enjoy this, and I sat down and went through it page by page and read all of the text in it. There is, of course, less text than you'd expect because there are many, many pages of just pictures. So this is, of course, the back cover of the book, which I figured, since the back cover just had a photograph of some arched windows from the side of a church and so on, I would throw it in there. But what's really interesting about small churches of Canada, as Kim Ondaatje says in her introduction, large churches tend to have been done in many stages. They have additions and subtractions and expansions, and it can make them inconsistent, but it also means that very frequently those large Gothic churches of the Middle Ages weren't built all at once. A lot of those churches actually have changes in the plan midway through, that you can actually track the different stages of construction, because you'll have stage 1 looks like this, and stage 2 looks like that, and stage 3 looks like a different thing, and you can tell that somebody got their hands on the plans at that point and made some changes. So she's got a lot of things in this book. She's got some more or less standard looking churches that, you know, you find out in the middle of nowhere. You've got some interesting ones like this church, which this is St. Saviour's Anglican from Barkerville in British Columbia. And you can see in this book, which by the way was published in 1982, which is particularly significant for reasons that I'll get back to in a second. So there's also a bunch of black and white photos, which black and white photos do have a certain evocative nature that is different from color. But, you know, you look at this and you have this interesting peak over the church, and you look at this siding up here that I cannot remember the proper name of. It's an unusual design, at least for a church, and that's doubled up in that bell tower on the peak. It's an unusual shape because you have sort of the typical church's peak, and then just this thing off to the side, this slant here, which maybe it's for members of the congregation, but it looks like somebody's just kind of attached a shack to the side. It's an interesting looking design, and it's the kind of thing that you get when you have people building churches, as this one was in 1869, that you get some Gothic influence, you get some square windows, you get some this chimney pipe off to the side, and it's so unusual and idiosyncratic and local. You also get this, and this Our Lady of the Way Roman Catholic from Haines Junction in the Yukon, that, as you can see in the little bit of the blurb below it that does appear, during the Second World War, American troops were building the Alaska Highway across the Yukon Territory, and they put up temporary camps. And what happened at that point was that the priest who was this particular itinerant pastor said, you know what local people need? They need a church. And he grabbed this Quonset building, this Father Morizet just grabbed the Quonset hut, dragged it out, and said, we're turning this into a chapel. So this is an American military Quonset hut for American military people to, put their barracks in for the duration. And he's just sort of turned it into a church. And it's such an interesting design, and so unusual, and entirely idiosyncratic to what you expect in backwoods areas, what you expect in places where you don't have the full weight of technology, the full strength and character of and weight and backing of the church to build something proper, and where you have these priests and these pastors and these itinerant preachers who are just putting up what they can. There are a lot of churches in this which are known as summer churches. That is, you have places that are cottage country, places where you have a lot of cabins that people go out to, but they're only there for the summer, and so the church is only used during the summer. And you have a lot of these. There's an interesting one that she mentions that is in the Northwest Territories, or at least is in the Northwest Territories at the time of the making of this book, that is entirely untenanted except for one old Inuit couple who basically stays there to look after it during the winter, but they're basically just out there in the middle of the nowhere by themselves. And now for Our Lady of Victory, Roman Catholic in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, which is based off of the notion of imitating an igloo. You can see very clearly that it's trying to evoke an igloo. And this brings me to one of the small points, if anyone ever tracks down and looks up this book, which is this book was written in 1980, this photographed, collected, put together in 1982. In 1999, for those of you who don't know, Canada decided that they were going to split what was formerly the Northwest Territories into 2 territories. So we now have what used to be 12 subdivisions in our country, 10 provinces and 2 territories, as there were when I was learning geography in school. In 1999, my last year of high school, they split the largest territory into 2 territories. So we now have the Northwest Territories, and to the eastern northern part of Canada, we have the territory of Nunavut, which has the capital city of Iqaluit, which has a Q in it and no U, and I long ago decided not to ask about how we wound up with some of these transliterations. In any event, so it's something to keep an eye on in the book, if you ever found it and decided to refer to it in some way, that you may find that some of these churches are actually no longer in the Northwest Territories because the border moved. And then there's this church. And this is an interesting little church because it's got a weird backstory that is also part of what makes this book interesting. Because there are a lot of little churches that have interesting backstories. Some of them are this church burned down and then they rebuilt it and then it burned down again. Some of the churches in this have no backstories. She just found something out in the middle of nowhere and couldn't find anybody who could tell her about it, but it was clearly a church, and so she took a picture and thought, I like this one, I'm sticking it in the book. There are some in here that aren't actually churches, that they are various kinds of houses of worship. There's a Buddhist temple out in the prairies that was set up by the Japanese many, many moons ago. But this particular one, here's the long shot, and here's a couple of interior shots of the Church of All Saints, which is an Anglican church in Kennington Manor, Saskatchewan. And this is a weird thing. I've left the blurb there more because I wanted to leave the name of the church up, but the blurb is basically that an English gentleman, Captain Edward Mitchell Pierce, decided to move to Carlisle, Saskatchewan in the 1880s after having apparently gone bankrupt and set up a settlement where the immigrants were more interested in cricket and croquet than in clearing and plowing the land, and so it lasted exactly 1 generation before it fell under because it reads as perhaps the most English upper-class twit action you could imagine. I'm going to move out to a frontier home and to set up there with my piano and my manor and have graceful Tudor church things and so on. And then it lasts, for 1 generation because the money runs out and everybody has to go home to England because you can't keep living like this out on the prairies if you are not either prohibitively ridiculously rich or actually willing to work. And so you have this church with its interesting little background story. And this is a wonderful example, as with the last small churches book that I looked over, of just ridiculous local minor minutiae. So I recommend it for those who have those kinds of interests. And that's all, and I will see you all next week.